Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be going through 10 tips to help you improve your portrait paintings using watercolors. So let's get straight into it with tip number 1, and that is to start off by painting the skin. I always paint the skin first when I paint portraits using watercolors, and this is because skin is smooth and the color changes are gradual. So this means that you need to use the wet in wet technique when painting the skin, which is a completely different technique than you would use for facial features, which need really sharp details. So this means that it is better to go in and paint the skin first and get the skin all finished, and then go over the top of the skin and add in all of the facial features afterwards. So add in all of the layers to the skin, make sure it's fully finished, and then build up all of the details over the top. Now moving on to tip number 2, and this is linked to the first one, and it is to use the wet on wet technique to paint the skin. So like I said, the skin is really smooth and has very gradual color changes, and the value changes in skin, so from the shadows into the midtones into the highlights, is a very gradual change. There isn't any harsh sort of changes between those values. And to avoid harsh watercolor edges and to ensure that the skin looks really smooth, I definitely recommend using the wet on wet technique. And so this technique is basically where you go in and you pre-wet the surface of the paper where the skin is, and then you add the watercolor over the top on top of that already wet surface. So you wet the surface of the paper just using clean water, and then you go over the top and drop in all of the watercolors that you mixed up for the skin tones and add in all of the shadows. And what happens is, because the paper is already wet, this allows the watercolors to bleed into each other, which gives you really natural color transitions, and also then you can glaze in other colors like pinks and yellows to get really natural, vibrant looking skin. So tip 3 is to mix up all of your skin colors first, and this is a really important tip. And this is so important because when you are using the wet on wet technique, it means you can only work on that specific layer whilst the paper is still wet. So if you pre-wet your paper and then mix up all of your skin colors and test all of those colors, your paper will start to dry as you are mixing up the skin colors, and so you won't have as long to work on that layer. So what I recommend doing is mixing up your skin colors, all of the different colors that you think you'll need for the skin, and testing your colors on a scrap piece of paper first, and then wet the skin with water so that you don't waste any time, because it can take you about 5 minutes to mix up all of your colors. And so if you wet the paper first, then that's 5 minutes where that paper is going to be drying, and so you won't have as long to work on your layer, and you will be more rushed, and that will probably mean that you get more harsh edges. So simply by doing it the other way around will make your experience with this technique a lot more successful. Now moving on to tip number 4, and that is to start by adding a light wash of paint over the skin first. So for your first layer, add a nice light base wash to the skin and add that all over the skin. So what I do is I mix up my paint to match the lightest color of the skin. So look at your reference and pinpoint where the highlights are in the skin, so where the brightest color of the skin is. And I mix up a color that matches with that highlight. And then I go in and I add this wash all over the skin, and this acts as a base color. And then you can go over the top once you've waited for that first wash to dry, pre-wet that paper, and use the wet on wet technique to build up all of the shadows on top of that base wash, and also to glaze in all of those other colors as well. Now tip number 5 is to work in layers. You won't be able to paint in all of the skin in one layer. When you notice that your paper is starting to dry, wait for it to dry completely, and then build up another layer on top by pre-wetting the paper and adding in more watercolor. If you try to do all of the skin in one layer, then you'll probably be rushing quite a lot, and it can be very stressful, and it doesn't need to be, because you can build it up in as many layers as you want. So those are my tips for painting the skin using watercolors. So I've gone through 5 tips there, and I feel like painting the skin is definitely the hardest part of painting the portrait. Now before we go through the other 5 tips, If you want to see how I created this full portrait in real time, then it is available over on my Patreon, as well as over 300 other real-time tutorials. For each tutorial, you will get the full narration, as well as the reference image, sketch outline, and materials list that you need to follow along with me. And for just a small amount per month, you'll get access to lots of real-time tutorials for lots of different mediums, not just watercolor, but colored pencil and charcoal and much more as well. But if a monthly membership isn't right for you, or you just want to focus on improving your watercolor skills, then over on my website I've got lots of individual courses to help you improve with your watercolor skills. I've got a couple of courses on there for realistic painting with watercolors, for example how to paint portraits in watercolors or how to paint hair in watercolors, and I've also got courses on a more expressive style, for example my expressive animals in watercolor course. So I recommend checking out my Patreon and my course website. If you are interested in my courses, then you can get 15% off all of my courses when you use the code SAVE15 at checkout. So I will leave a link to my Patreon and to my website in the description below. But let's move on to tip number 6. And so this is for painting in your facial features. Now that we've worked on the skin, we can now start to move on to painting in the eyes and the nose and the lips and all of the other stuff. So tip number 6 is to paint the facial features in using the wet on dry technique. So when you have finished painting the skin and it is completely dried, it is time to start painting in the facial features. Now the features need to be sharp and detailed, so we need to use the wet on dry technique for this. So this way, when you go in and paint in all of the eyebrow hairs and eyelashes, the details will be really nice and crisp. And so for this technique, all you need to do is simply mix up the colours that you're using and paint them straight onto the paper. You don't have to pre-wet the paper or anything like that, because we're using the wet on dry technique. It basically means that we're applying wet paint onto the dry surface of the paper. And this is a great technique because you really don't have to rush. There's no time limit on how long you need to take for your layer, because you don't have to do it whilst the paper is wet. So you really can spend your time building up all of those details. Now let's move on to tip number 7, and that is to use the appropriate sized brushes for each area. So when you're painting a portrait, you don't want to just use one brush for the whole painting. It's really important that you use the appropriate brush for each part of the portrait. So I like to use larger brushes when I'm painting in the skin, and then for details like the eyelashes, for example, I like to use really tiny round paint brushes so I can get in all of those fine details. If you was to use a really tiny paintbrush when you were painting in the skin, not only would it take you a long time, but it was more likely to look really blotchy. And if you was to use a really large paintbrush when you're painting in details like the eyelashes, you're not going to be able to get in that high level of detail that you need. So that might sound like an obvious tip, but it is so important to use a varied amount of brushes. So moving on to tip number 8. Don't be afraid to mix styles. Just because you are painting a portrait, that doesn't mean it has to be in a really realistic style. Personally, I like to use a combination of realism and a more expressive style when I'm painting my watercolor portraits. I quite often do the face in a realistic style, but then I like to do the hair and the clothing in a loose, expressive style. And I really do think that mixing these styles together can make your painting look even more interesting. Because when you're painting with realism, you are using a certain amount of techniques, and then when you're painting more expressively, you are adding lots of different techniques like splatters, and I also use stuff like water drops to create really interesting looks as well. So adding in all those different techniques together really does make the painting look a lot more interesting. Now let's move on to tip number 9, and that is to make sure that you preserve the highlights in your painting. It is really hard to get highlights back once you've painted over them with watercolor. Therefore, I really recommend analysing your reference before you start the painting process so that you know where the brightest highlights are and so that you can avoid painting over them. So for example, one part of your portrait that tends to have highlights is inside the eyes. There will be these little tiny highlights. and they are usually very bright. So little tiny highlights like that, you really want to make sure that you notice, that you can preserve them, and so that you don't accidentally paint over them, because watercolors is one of the mediums where it is hard to get highlights back. However, you can go over with white gouache if you do accidentally darken up your highlights a little bit. And now finally, let's move on to tip number 10, and that is to experiment with mixed media. So try incorporating other mediums in with your watercolors to make your portrait as good as it can be. So personally, I like using colored pencils just at the end of my watercolor painting to add a little bit more definition and fine details to my paintings that can sometimes be really hard to get with a paintbrush. Even if you're using a really small paintbrush, normally the lead of a pencil can get in tinier, finer details than you can with a brush. So I do like incorporating a little bit of colored pencil right at the end, specifically to do a bit more detail in the eyes, to do some eyelashes, or just to crispen up the jawline or any edge that is a bit blurry that needs to be made a bit sharper. Also, like I said, you can use stuff like white gouache, and that is great for adding in highlights back to areas that you have accidentally painted over. But those are my 10 tips for painting portraits using watercolors. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comments section what tip did you find the most useful, and let everyone know if you have any other tips for painting portraits using watercolors. But thank you all so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.